I spent 5 days camping alone in a remote, lesser-known national forest in southeastern Utah. I wasn't new to camping, far from it. I had years of experience and had explored many forests before. While I had never been to this exact location, I was familiar with the surrounding areas, which gave me a sense of confidence going in. The first 3 days passed quietly, almost too quietly. No other campers showed up, no distant voices, no passing hikers, just endless silence stretching through the trees. During the day, I kept myself busy, reading beside the fire, cooking simple meals, and wandering through the woods, taking in the stillness of nature. But there was something about that silence. It didn't feel peaceful. It felt watchful, like the forest wasn't empty at all, just waiting. On the third night, I sat beside a small, steady campfire. The sky above me was perfectly clear, filled with countless stars. I leaned back, trying to enjoy the moment, letting the calmness settle in. And then, a scream shattered the silence. It was loud, sudden, violent, a man's voice, screaming at the top of his lungs from somewhere deep in the darkness. My entire body froze. The sound echoed through the trees, distant, but not distant enough. It felt close, too close. I slowly stood up, my eyes locked on the darkness beyond the firelight, trying to pinpoint where the scream had come from. But it was useless. The forest swallowed everything beyond a few feet of visibility. The shadows between the trees felt thick, almost unnatural, like something was hiding just outside the reach of the fire. The scream had sounded like it came from about half a mile away, somewhere in the direction of a small lake I knew existed deeper in the forest. And then, nothing. No second scream, no movement, no footsteps, just silence again. A heavy, suffocating silence. It was as if the forest itself had forced whatever made that sound to stop. I stood there for a while, listening carefully, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct in my body was telling me something was wrong, but I didn't want to believe it. Eventually, I tried to rationalize it. It has to be a mountain lion. I'd heard before that mountain lions can make terrifying, almost human-like screams at night. Not exactly human, but close enough to trick you if you weren't paying attention. That had to be it. It made sense. At least, it was the only explanation that made sense. But deep down, I knew the truth. That scream didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a person in absolute terror. I pushed the thought away, convincing myself I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. After a while, I crawled into my tent and somehow managed to fall asleep. Surprisingly, nothing else happened that night. No more screams, no footsteps, no signs that anything was out there. But the feeling didn't leave. That quiet, creeping feeling that I wasn't alone.
Morning came, and with it, a false sense of relief. Sunlight poured through the trees, washing away the shadows that had terrified me the night before. Everything looked normal again. Calm, harmless, almost like nothing had happened. I stayed around my campsite for a while, making breakfast and trying to shake off the uneasiness. Eventually, I convinced myself there was no real danger, that whatever I heard last night had to be an animal. Still, I needed to be sure, so I decided to head toward the lake, the same direction the scream had come from. The walk there was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, not even the sound of insects, just the crunch of my footsteps echoing through the trees. When I finally reached the lake, something immediately felt wrong. On the opposite side of the shoreline, I could see the sand had been disturbed badly. I circled around, moving slowly, my eyes scanning every inch of the ground. And as I got closer, my stomach dropped. There was junk scattered everywhere. Plastic bags, food wrappers, random debris. But it wasn't just thrown around randomly. It formed a line, a disturbingly straight line. All of it followed a deep, narrow groove carved into the sand, as if something heavy had been dragged across the ground. My heart started racing as I followed the trail with my eyes. The drag marks led straight to the edge of the lake, and then stopped. I slowly looked out over the lake. The surface was completely still. No ripples, no movement, no sign that anything had entered the water. It looked untouched, and that was the worst part, because something had clearly been dragged there. But whatever it was gone. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I didn't stay any longer. I turned around and walked back, faster this time. My eyes kept darting between the trees, feeling like something might step out at any second. By the time I reached my campsite, my chest felt tight. Safer, maybe, but not safe. Not even close. Back at my campsite, I tried to act normal. I told myself not to overthink what I had seen. Maybe it was just trash left behind by careless campers. Maybe the drag marks meant nothing. The more I tried to explain it away, the more forced it felt. But I needed something to hold on to. So I distracted myself. I made lunch, cleaned up around the site, avoided looking too deeply into the forest. As night slowly crept in, that same uneasy feeling returned. The fire became my only source of comfort, its flickering light pushing back the darkness just enough to make me feel somewhat in control. About an hour into the night, I realized I had made a mistake. I hadn't collected enough firewood. Trying not to panic, I stood up and began walking around the outer edge of my campsite, picking up small, dry sticks scattered on the ground. The darkness beyond the firelight felt heavier now, thicker, like it was pressing in on me. And then I heard it. A voice, a faint whisper from somewhere just ahead of me in the dark. I froze instantly. It was quiet, too quiet to understand what was said, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. It was a human voice. I didn't have my flashlight with me. The darkness was nearly absolute beyond a few feet. My heart began pounding as I tried to locate where the sound had come from, but it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. And somehow, it didn't feel like it was directed at me. That made it worse. I backed away slowly at first, then turned and hurried straight back to the fire. My hands were shaking. I sat there, staring into the flames, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, that maybe the wind had twisted through the trees in just the right way to sound like a whisper. But then I remembered the scream, the lake, the drag marks, and suddenly all the excuses fell apart. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was in the woods, and they were close.
I stayed by the fire, gripping anything that made me feel even slightly in control. At that point, I had only two options: stay and hope whoever or whatever was out there left me alone until morning, or leave and risk walking straight into the darkness where they could be waiting. Leaving felt worse. Out there, beyond the firelight, I would be blind, vulnerable, an easy target. So I stayed. But the fire was dying again. I had no choice. This time, I grabbed my flashlight before stepping out to collect more wood. I moved slowly, carefully scanning the darkness, every nerve in my body on edge. Then, the whisper came back, closer this time. I snapped the flashlight toward the sound, the beam cutting weakly through the trees, but it barely illuminated anything. The light felt useless, swallowed by the darkness almost immediately. And then I heard it again. Not one voice, multiple, soft, low, whispering back and forth. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel the intent. They were communicating about me. Panic surged through my chest as I grabbed what wood I could and rushed back to the fire. I threw the sticks into the flames, forcing it to grow, to push the darkness back just a little further. But it wasn't enough. For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep. Every hour, I forced myself to step out and gather more wood, and almost every time I heard them. 3, maybe 4 different voices, always whispering, always just out of sight. It felt like they were watching me, tracking every move I made, waiting. The final 2 hours before sunrise were different. No voices, no movement, just silence again. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like they had left, or worse, like they didn't need to hide anymore. The moment the first light of morning broke through the trees, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't eat, I didn't hesitate. I just left. The trail out led in the same direction the voices had come from. Every step felt wrong, like I was walking straight into something I didn't understand. Along the path, I noticed footprints scattered in the dirt, but there was no way to know whose they were. Other hikers, maybe, or them. I made it out, safe, but with no answers, no reports, no missing persons, no explanation for what I experienced in those woods. And honestly, I'm not sure I want one. This happened back in 2015. At the time, I was still fairly new to this kind of camping, going off-trail, away from designated campgrounds and truly being alone in the wilderness. I had camped plenty before, but usually in places filled with other people, where campsites were set up with tables, fire pits, and a sense of safety. This time, I wanted something different, something quieter, something more isolated. The trail I chose was about a 2-hour hike into a remote forest. It wasn't very popular. There were barely any photos of it online, and information about the area was limited. But that actually made it more appealing to me. It felt like an adventure. I started my hike a few hours after sunrise. When I arrived at the trailhead, the parking area was completely empty. Not a single car, just a small patch of dirt off the side of the road. That should have been my first warning. The hike started off normal, peaceful even. The forest was calm and the path was easy to follow. But about 30 minutes in, I noticed someone ahead of me on the trail. A man. He was walking slowly, extremely slowly. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as I kept walking, I realized I was catching up to him way too quickly. It wasn't just slow, it felt deliberate, almost unnatural. Normally, I would have slowed down to avoid passing someone, but in this case, it wasn't really an option, so I decided to just go around him. As I got closer, I casually said, "Hey." The moment I stepped beside him, he suddenly matched my pace, like a switch had been flipped. I glanced over, confused, and that's when he turned to me with a slight smile and asked how my day was going. Before I could even fully process it, he extended his hand. "My name's Oscar." I hesitated for a split second, then shook his hand. Something about him felt off, but I couldn't quite explain why. I told him my name, and just like that, we started walking together. At first, it felt normal. Oscar spoke casually, asking simple questions: where I was from, how often I camped, what brought me out here. His tone was relaxed, almost friendly enough to make me forget how strangely this interaction had started. But something still didn't sit right with me. There was a subtle tension in the way he spoke, like he was choosing his words carefully. And every now and then, I'd catch him glancing at me, not in a curious way, but like he was studying me. Still, I kept talking. We walked together for about 30 minutes. During that time, I noticed something odd. He wasn't carrying anything. No backpack, no gear, nothing. That didn't make sense for someone out this deep in the forest, so I asked him about it. He smiled and told me he had already set up his campsite earlier and was just out for a walk. He said his spot was a little further ahead, deeper into the trees, past the main camping area I was heading toward. That explanation made sense, at least on the surface. At some point, I mentioned that I was still kind of new to this type of camping, being out here alone, away from designated areas. That's when he made an offer. He said he'd been coming to this place for years and knew it really well. Then, almost casually, he invited me to stop by his campsite later that evening, to sit around his fire and have dinner. I paused for a second. Something about the invitation felt too easy, too convenient. But at the same time, it also felt like a good opportunity. Meeting someone experienced out here could be helpful. And honestly, the idea of not being completely alone out here for one night was a little comforting. So I agreed. We continued walking until we reached the main camping area. I stopped to set up my tent while Oscar kept moving forward, disappearing into the trees where he said his campsite was. I watched him go for a moment. Then he was gone. The rest of the day passed quietly. Hours went by, but I didn't see him again. Not once. No movement in the trees, no distant avaz, nothing. It was like he had completely vanished. And as the sun began to set, I started to question whether following him later was a good idea at all. By the time the sun started sinking behind the trees, I had almost convinced myself not to go. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet again, just like the night before in that other place. No birds, no wind, just a heavy stillness pressing down on everything. I sat by my small fire, staring into the flames, replaying the conversation in my head. Something about Oscar didn't feel right, but before I could make a final decision, he appeared, walking calmly out from the trees, like he had been there the whole time, just out of sight. "Everything going all right?" he asked casually. His voice sounded normal, too normal. We talked for a few minutes, just like earlier, and then, without hesitation, he asked if I still wanted to come by his campfire. There was a brief moment where I thought about saying no. I should have said no, but instead, I agreed. I stood up and followed him. We left my campsite behind and moved deeper into the forest. At first, I could still faintly see the clearing where my tent was set up. but after a couple of minutes, it disappeared completely. All that remained was darkness and trees. We walked for about 5 minutes, maybe more. It felt longer, long enough for me to realize we were going much farther than I expected, farther than what felt safe. Then finally, I saw it, a faint orange glow flickering between the trees, his campfire. As we got closer, the shapes around it became clearer, and that's when my stomach dropped. Oscar wasn't alone. 2 other men were sitting there, waiting. He had never mentioned them, not once. All 3 of them looked up at me at the same time, smiling. But something about those smiles felt wrong, cold, empty. I had already come too far to turn back without making it obvious, so I forced myself to stay calm and walked into the campsite. They greeted me casually, like this was completely normal, like I was expected. I sat down beside them, trying to act relaxed, trying to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. The fire crackled softly between us. They were making something simple, just instant ramen, boiling water over the flames. At first, the conversation was normal, small talk, but it didn't last, because after a few minutes, everything went quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't feel natural, the kind that feels planned. And that's when I started noticing it. Every time I looked up at them, they were already looking at me.
The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. No one spoke. Oscar kept poking at the fire, slowly stirring the boiling water like nothing was wrong. The other 2 men sat across from me, completely still, watching. Every time I glanced up, their eyes shifted away just a second too late, like they had been staring the whole time. A cold wave of dread crept over me. Every instinct in my body was screaming the same thing. Get out. Now. But I couldn't just panic and run. Not yet. I needed a reason, something that wouldn't immediately trigger a reaction. So I forced a casual tone and said, "Hey, I'm gonna head back to my camp real quick, grab something from my bag. Save me a bowl. I'll be right back." No response. Oscar didn't even look up. He just kept stirring the pot like he hadn't heard me at all. The other 2 men said nothing either. They just stared. The silence that followed felt endless, heavy, wrong. After a few seconds that felt like minutes, I slowly stood up. No one stopped me. No one spoke. I turned and began walking away. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. Behind me, I heard movement. Not loud, but enough. I glanced back over my shoulder. Both men were standing now, facing me, watching. Oscar still hadn't moved. He was still sitting by the fire, not even acknowledging what was happening. I didn't wait. I turned and kept walking, faster this time, trying to stay calm, trying not to break into a run too early. But the feeling hit me almost immediately. That heavy, suffocating presence behind me, like I was being followed. I didn't want to look back again. Every part of me was afraid of what I might see. But after a minute, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned. The campsite was still visible through the trees, the faint glow of the fire flickering in the distance. The logs we had been sitting on were still there, but the men were gone. All 3 of them, gone. Not walking away, not standing nearby, just gone, like they had vanished into the forest. That's when fear took over completely. I turned and sprinted. I ran, harder than I had ever run in my life. Branches whipped past my face, roots caught at my feet. The forest turned into a blur of darkness and shadows, and I didn't slow down long enough to think. My only goal was simple: get back to my campsite, get my things, get out. But the deeper I ran into the trees, the more wrong everything felt. No sound behind me, no footsteps, no voices, just silence. And that silence was worse than anything else, because it felt like I wasn't being chased anymore. It felt like I had already been let go. When I finally reached my campsite, my breathing was ragged. I immediately started packing everything I could, shoving gear into my bag, not caring about order or damage. My hands were shaking the entire time. I kept looking up between movements, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But nothing was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late, that they were still close, just not visible anymore. Once I had enough packed, I didn't hesitate. I left. I abandoned the rest of my gear and started down the trail at a fast walk that quickly turned into a run. The forest felt different now, like it was watching me leave. Every shadow looked like a person standing still. Every rustle felt like movement just outside my vision. I didn't stop until I reached the parking area. My truck was still there. Empty lot. No other vehicles. Just like before. As I drove away, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel, I made the decision to call the police. I didn't have proof of anything. No names beyond Oscar. No physical evidence, just my word. But I told them everything anyway. They later checked the area and confirmed something strange. There were no other vehicles parked anywhere near the trail. None. Which meant whoever those men were, they hadn't driven in, or they had left long before anyone noticed. Or worse, they were never meant to be found in the first place. To this day, I still don't know what their intention was, but I know this much. That forest didn't feel empty. It felt occupied, and I was never really alone out there. This happened back in 2015. I had a young, very active retriever mix named Sammy. She had been my camping partner for years, loyal, energetic, and extremely protective. We had been on countless road trips and short camping trips together, and she always loved being outdoors. This trip, however, was different. It wasn't a long expedition, just a familiar forest about an hour away from home, a place I had visited many times before. It was my safe spot, a quiet campsite where I could relax without much planning or travel. We arrived in the early afternoon, around 2 p.m. At first, everything seemed normal. I set up our campsite while Sammy ran around excitedly, sniffing the ground and exploring like she always did. But something felt off. Sammy wasn't acting like herself. Usually, the moment we arrived somewhere like this, she would be full of energy, running in circles, wagging her tail, eager to explore every corner of the area. This time, she wasn't. Instead, she stood close to me, tense and alert. Her body language was stiff, like she was sensing something I couldn't see. I looked around the forest. Nothing. No movement, no sounds. Just a strange, heavy silence hanging between the trees. After about 30 minutes, Sammy suddenly relaxed again, almost as if whatever she sensed had disappeared. She went back to her usual self, playing with sticks, running short distances, acting playful and normal. I brushed it off. Maybe she had just picked up the scent of another animal earlier. That wasn't unusual for her. I made us some food, built a campfire, and tried to enjoy the peaceful afternoon. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something had already been watching us. As the afternoon slowly faded, the forest around us became quieter. Not
peaceful quiet. This was different. It felt like the entire environment had gradually stopped making noise, as if everything living inside the woods had suddenly decided to stay still. Sammy was lying next to me near the fire when I noticed her behavior shift again. Her ears went up first. Then, her body stiffened. She slowly stood up, staring straight ahead into the tree line. I followed her gaze. At first, I saw nothing, just darkness forming between the trunks of the trees as the light began to fade. Then, I noticed it. A slight movement, something shifting just beyond the edge of visibility. Before I could fully process it, Sammy snapped. She lunged forward with a sudden burst of aggression, barking and growling violently as she ran straight into the trees. It happened so fast, I barely had time to react. "Sammy!" I yelled, immediately chasing after her, but she didn't stop. She was locked onto something I couldn't see. Branches hit my face as I ran, trying to keep up, but she was faster than me in the uneven terrain. Within seconds, she was already deep in the forest, her barking echoing in the distance. Then, silence. No more barking, no more movement, just the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. I stopped for a moment, listening carefully. Nothing. That's when the panic started to rise. I called her name over and over, moving deeper into the trees, trying to stay oriented, trying not to lose my way. But the forest felt different now, heavier, like it was closing in around me, and Sammy was gone. The forest grew darker faster than it should have. Even though it wasn't fully night yet, the trees seemed to swallow the remaining daylight, turning everything into long, distorted shadows. I kept calling Sammy's name. No answer, no barking, nothing. Just silence stretching endlessly between the trees. I moved carefully now, trying to not get myself lost while still searching for her. Every direction looked the same. Every tree felt identical. It was like the forest had reshaped itself the moment I stepped deeper inside. Minutes passed, then more. Still nothing. That's when I noticed something on the ground. A small metallic glint reflecting my flashlight. I knelt down slowly. It was Sammy's dog tag. My stomach dropped instantly. It was lying in the grass like it had been torn off in a hurry. The collar wasn't there, just the dog tag. Cold, silent, out of place. For a moment, my mind went to the worst possible scenario, but I forced myself to stay calm. I stood up and scanned the area carefully with my flashlight, sweeping it across the ground and trees. And then, I saw her. Sammy. She was lying near a tree just a short distance away, alive, but completely still. She wasn't injured, but she was shaking violently. Her body was pressed against the ground, and she refused to move even when I called her name. It took a while before she finally reacted to me, slowly, carefully, like she was afraid of something I couldn't see. I picked her up immediately. She didn't resist. She didn't even try to stand. For the first time, I realized just how scared she was. Whatever she had chased, it wasn't an animal. I carried Sammy back toward the campsite as fast as I could. She stayed pressed against me the entire time, trembling slightly, her head tucked in close like she didn't want to see anything around us anymore. Whatever had happened out there had completely broken her usual confidence. The walk back felt longer than before. The forest didn't feel normal anymore. It felt disturbed, like something had moved through it recently. When we finally reached the clearing, I slowed down immediately. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The campsite was destroyed. My tent was torn open, fabric ripped in jagged lines. My backpack had been dumped out completely, its contents scattered across the ground like someone had searched through it in a hurry or out of frustration. Everything was everywhere. Food, gear, clothes, tools, all thrown around randomly. I froze for a moment, scanning the area with my flashlight. No movement, no sound, just the aftermath. I quickly knelt down and started grabbing whatever I could salvage, stuffing items back into my bag as fast as possible. My hands were shaking, but I didn't want to stay there any longer than necessary. Sammy stayed close, but now she was alert again, eyes locked into the darkness between the trees, watching, waiting. Then I noticed it too, a feeling like something was not alone. I slowly lifted my flashlight again and scanned the tree line. Nothing visible, but the presence was still there. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like something had just left, moments before we arrived. Or worse, was still nearby, watching us from somewhere I couldn't see. That was enough for me. I stopped gathering things. We had to go. Now.
I didn't bother finishing packing. Whatever I could grab in a hurry went into my bag, and everything else was left behind. Survival didn't feel like it depended on gear anymore. It felt like it depended on leaving that place immediately. Sammy stayed unusually close, walking right beside me the entire time. No pulling ahead, no wandering off, just quiet, controlled fear. We started moving down the trail. The forest around us felt different now. Not just quiet, watchful. Every shadow between the trees looked deeper than it should have been. Every small sound felt intentional, like it was being made to test whether I would react. I kept looking over my shoulder. Nothing followed, but that didn't make it better. It made it worse, because it felt like whatever was there didn't need to follow anymore. We walked for over an hour. The deeper we got into the known trail, the more my body started to relax, but my mind didn't. Sammy stayed silent the whole time. No barking, no pulling, just walking close to me, like she was afraid I might disappear if she let go. Eventually, the trees started to thin. We could finally see the faint outline of my truck through the distance. That sight should have felt like relief, but instead I felt uneasy, like we were being allowed to leave. We reached the truck without incident. No movement in the woods, no sounds behind us, just silence. I loaded Sammy inside first, then quickly threw whatever I had salvaged into the back. My hands were still shaking when I got into the driver's seat. For a moment, I just sat there, looking at the forest, waiting. But nothing came out. Nothing moved. I started the engine and drove away. Only when the trail disappeared behind me did I finally exhale. Sammy recovered physically within a few days, but emotionally, she was different for a while. Quieter, more alert than before, like she remembered something I couldn't see. Even now, years later, I still don't know what was in that forest. But I know one thing for certain. Whatever chased her that day was never supposed to be seen clearly.